The sealed chamber beneath Chicago's most exclusive financial tower would expose a 90-year-old royal heist, underground smuggling networks, and billionaire collectors who traded in treasures that were never supposed to exist, all triggered by one-night janitor's accidental discovery while cleaning the executive boardroom after a power outage left her stranded on the 47th floor. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And as stories of hidden potential and second chances inspire you, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have something truly extraordinary waiting for you. The harsh fluorescent lights of Sterling Financial Tower cast dancing shadows across the polished granite lobby as Elena Rodriguez guided her cleaning cart through the after-hours silence of downtown Chicago. The October wind howled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rattling the glass with the fury of a storm that had knocked out power to half the city earlier that evening. Emergency generators hummed steadily in the basement, providing just enough electricity to keep the essential systems running and the security lights glowing like lonely beacons in the urban darkness. At 38 years old, Elena moved with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to make every motion count during long nights of invisible labor. Her dark hair, now streaked with premature silver threads that caught the fluorescent light, was pulled back in a practical ponytail secured with an elastic band that had seen better days. Deep lines of exhaustion framed her brown eyes, eyes that had once sparkled with academic passion and intellectual curiosity, but now reflected the bone-deep weariness of someone carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. Elena checked her watch with practiced efficiency. 11:47 p.m. The storm had delayed her usual routine by nearly 2 hours, throwing off the precisely timed schedule that governed her nights. But she couldn't afford to leave early or cut corners. Every minute of overtime represented precious dollars that would go toward the crushing mountain of medical bills that had destroyed her former life with the systematic thoroughness of a natural disaster. She pressed the call button for the executive elevator, her master key card granting access to floors that most of the building's daytime occupants would never see, even after years of working in the same building. As the elevator climbed smoothly toward the 47th floor, Elena's reflection stared back at her from the polished steel doors. The woman looking back seemed like a stranger sometimes, tired, worn down by circumstances, but still carrying herself with an unconscious dignity that spoke of better days. Where was the confident professor who had once lectured halls full of eager undergraduate students about the art, culture, and political intrigue of medieval European history? Where was the passionate researcher who had spent countless hours in dusty archives across 3 countries, piecing together fragments of evidence like an intellectual detective pursuing the mysteries of long-lost royal treasures? The answer to those questions was both complicated and heartbreakingly simple, a story as old as American healthcare and as personal as a mother's love for her child. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been living her professional dream just 18 months ago, inhabiting a world where her expertise mattered and her future seemed not just secure, but genuinely bright. With a PhD in medieval European history from Northwestern University and a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at the Art Institute of Chicago, she was widely considered one of the most promising young scholars in her specialized field. Her academic reputation was built on meticulous research, innovative theories, and a rare gift for connecting seemingly unrelated historical fragments into coherent narratives that challenged conventional wisdom. Elena's particular specialty was royal ceremonial objects and crown jewels, especially those that had disappeared during the systematic cultural looting that occurred throughout World War II. She had become a recognized expert in what historians referred to as the great art theft of the 20th century, the organized displacement of priceless cultural artifacts during the war years, when political chaos and military occupation created opportunities for both systematic Nazi plundering and desperate attempts by noble families to hide their treasures from advancing armies. Her specific focus was the Bavarian Crown Collection, a legendary set of medieval royal regalia that had vanished from Munich's residence palace in early 1943.
The historical significance of the Bavarian collection extended far beyond its monetary value, though that value was estimated in the hundreds of millions, even by 1940s standards. These were objects that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had been present at coronations that shaped the map of Europe, and represented artistic techniques and craftsmanship that had been lost to time. Their disappearance was considered one of the greatest cultural tragedies of the modern era, a wound in the historical record that had never properly healed. Elena had devoted 7 years of her academic career to unraveling the mystery of what had happened to the Bavarian collection. While most historians assumed the treasures had been destroyed during the Allied bombing of Munich or lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse, Elena had developed a revolutionary theory based on years of painstaking archival research. She believed the collection hadn't been destroyed at all. Instead, she had accumulated evidence suggesting that high-ranking Nazi officials, recognizing Germany's eventual defeat, had secretly arranged to ship the most valuable cultural artifacts to America as part of elaborate schemes to create hidden assets for their post-war survival. Her research had taken her to archives in Germany, Switzerland, and the United States, following paper trails that most scholars had dismissed as dead ends. She had interviewed elderly survivors, analyzed shipping records from Swiss banks, and traced the movement of other known artifacts that had surfaced decades later in American private collections. The pattern she uncovered suggested a sophisticated network of cultural smuggling that had operated under the cover of wartime chaos. Elena's breakthrough had come through her analysis of shipping manifests from neutral Swiss ports between 1943 and 1945. Cross-referencing these documents with banking records and immigration papers, she had identified specific vessels that appeared to have carried undeclared cargo to American ports. More significantly, she had traced several Nazi officials who had disappeared from Europe during this period and later surfaced in America with mysteriously substantial financial resources and connections to elite collecting circles. The implications of her research were staggering. If Elena's theory was correct, dozens of Europe's most significant cultural treasures hadn't been destroyed during the war. They were still hidden in private American collections, held by families who had unknowingly purchased stolen artifacts or, in some cases, were direct descendants of the original smugglers. Elena's work had attracted serious attention from the international museum community. The Smithsonian Institution had expressed formal interest in her research and invited her to present her findings at their annual symposium on wartime cultural losses. The Getty Museum had begun preliminary discussions about funding an expanded investigation. Several major European museums were considering collaborative projects to trace other missing collections using Elena's methodology. More personally thrilling, 3 universities had made informal inquiries about tenured faculty positions that would allow Elena to continue her research while teaching the next generation of historians. Her future had seemed not just secure, but luminous with possibility. She was on the verge of making discoveries that could reshape understanding of wartime cultural losses and potentially lead to the recovery of priceless artifacts that the world had assumed were lost forever. Then came the phone call that changed everything with the sudden, devastating efficiency of a natural disaster. Mrs. Rodriguez. The pediatric oncologist's voice had been professionally gentle but unmistakably urgent over the phone that terrible Tuesday morning in March. I need you to come to Children's Memorial Hospital immediately. Miguel's test results have come back, and we need to discuss his condition right away. Miguel. Her beautiful, brilliant 12-year-old son who had been complaining of persistent headaches and unusual fatigue for several weeks. Miguel, who I initially assumed was simply stressed about the recent divorce and the major changes in their family structure. Miguel, whose pediatrician had initially dismissed his symptoms as probable growing pains combined with emotional adjustment issues related to his parents' separation. The diagnosis hit Elena with the force of a physical blow: acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common form of childhood cancer, but also thankfully one of the most treatable when caught in its early stages. The doctors explained the treatment protocol with careful optimism: immediate chemotherapy, possibly a bone marrow transplant depending on how he responded to initial treatment, and definitely months of intensive medical care that would require one parent to be available essentially full-time. Elena's ex-husband Carlos, a construction worker who had been laid off 6 months ago due to the economic downturn, was in no position to provide the kind of constant care and medical advocacy that Miguel's condition would require. The responsibility fell naturally to Elena, and she accepted it without a moment of hesitation or consideration of the professional consequences. Her son's life was worth infinitely more than any career achievement, any research breakthrough, any academic recognition.
But the financial reality of childhood cancer treatment in America proved to be as devastating as the diagnosis itself. Even with their relatively good insurance coverage through the university, the costs were astronomical and seemed to multiply daily. Co-payments for specialist consultations, deductibles for experimental treatments not fully covered by their plan, travel expenses for seeking second opinions at renowned cancer centers, the cost of a full-time caregiver during Elena's initial attempts to maintain her work schedule. The bills accumulated with terrifying speed. Within 6 months, Elena had burned through their modest savings account, the small inheritance she had received from her grandmother, and the emergency fund she had been building for Miguel's eventual college education. She took a temporary leave of absence from the Art Institute, assuming she could return once Miguel's treatment stabilized and they established a manageable routine. But childhood cancer, Elena discovered, doesn't follow predictable schedules or respect careful plans. Miguel's treatment required constant adjustments, frequent hospitalizations for complications, and Elena's complete attention during the most vulnerable phases of his chemotherapy. Her fellowship funding, which had been generously held for the first few months, eventually had to be transferred to another researcher who could actually fulfill the position's requirements. Her academic position was maintained for as long as possible, with colleagues and supervisors who genuinely understood the impossible situation she faced. But museums and research institutions, even the most supportive ones, ultimately need scholars who can attend conferences, meet publication deadlines, and maintain the collaborative relationships that drive academic progress. Elena's research into the Bavarian collection, so close to breakthrough discoveries, had to be set aside indefinitely. Miguel's treatment proved successful, a miracle for which Elena would be grateful for the rest of her life. After 10 months of chemotherapy, countless hospital stays, and more fear than any parent should have to endure, he was declared in complete remission. The doctors were optimistic about his long-term prognosis, and Miguel himself showed the remarkable resilience that seemed to be a special gift of childhood. But the financial damage was complete and irreversible. Elena found herself facing a choice between declaring bankruptcy, which would have destroyed her credit and made finding any decent housing nearly impossible, or finding whatever work would pay enough to service the debt while still allowing her to care for her recovering son and maintain the stable home environment his continued health required. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Elena needed work that paid significantly more than adjunct teaching positions, had flexible enough hours to accommodate Miguel's ongoing medical appointments, and her need to be present when he came home from school each morning, and to return before he came home each afternoon, maintaining the illusion of normal family life despite their dramatically changed circumstances. Elena would sleep from 6:30 a.m. to 2 p.m., wake up to help Miguel with homework and drive him to his regular medical checkups, prepare dinner together while discussing his school day, and then return to Sterling Tower for another night of methodical, invisible labor. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was sustainable. And sustainability had become Elena's primary goal after the chaos of Miguel's treatment year.
Most of Sterling Financial's daytime occupants never saw Elena or gave any thought to how their offices maintained their pristine appearance. To them, the cleaning happened by magic. Wastebaskets emptied themselves, surfaces dusted themselves, carpets vacuumed themselves through some invisible process they never had to consider or appreciate. Elena preferred this anonymity. The fewer people who might recognize her from her former academic life, the smaller the chance of awkward conversations about what had happened to the promising Dr. Rodriguez, who had once been featured in Smithsonian Magazine. But sometimes, late at night, when she was cleaning the executive floors where the company's most important clients maintained private offices, Elena would catch painful glimpses of the world she had lost. Art history books on executives' shelves, auction catalogs for medieval artifacts left casually on conference tables, academic research papers, sometimes including her own published work, scattered across desks where collectors consulted scholarly sources before making multi-million-dollar purchases. Those moments were the most difficult part of Elena's new reality. Not the physical labor, which was honest work that she approached with the same methodical thoroughness she had once applied to archival research. Not even the financial stress, which was manageable as long as she maintained perfect attendance and Miguel stayed healthy. The hardest part was seeing constant reminders of the expertise that had once defined her professional identity, now gathering dust in her memory while she pushed mops and emptied wastebaskets for people who would never know that their cleaning lady could probably authenticate the medieval artifacts hanging in their private offices. The elevator reached the 47th floor with its familiar soft chime, interrupting Elena's regular evening reflection on the strange turns her life had taken. The executive level of Sterling Financial was a testament to old money elegance and traditional American wealth. Mahogany-paneled walls that gleamed under carefully positioned lighting, Persian rugs worth more than Elena's annual salary spread across polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of stern-faced company founders who had built their financial empire during Chicago's industrial boom at the turn of the 20th century. Tonight felt different from Elena's usual routine, though she couldn't immediately identify why. The power outage had left several sections of the building running on emergency lighting rather than the usual warm ambient illumination, casting unusual shadows across corridors that were normally as predictable as a museum display. Most of the building's daytime occupants had left early due to the storm warnings, creating an atmosphere of emptiness that felt more pronounced than the typical after-hours quiet. Elena began her systematic routine, methodically working through each office with the efficiency born of 18 months of repetitive practice. Empty wastebaskets, vacuum Persian rugs, dust mahogany surfaces, restock supply closets, check that windows were properly secured against the storm. The work was mindless enough that her thoughts could wander freely, which was both a blessing and a curse, depending on her mood. Sometimes Elena used the mental space to rehearse lectures she would never give again, organizing her thoughts about medieval craftsmanship techniques or the political implications of royal regalia as if she were still preparing for academic conferences. Other times, she found herself unconsciously analyzing the decorative elements in Sterling Financial's architecture, noting how the building's designers had incorporated medieval-inspired details that most people probably never noticed, but that jumped out to someone with her specialized training. She was approaching the corner office of Victoria Sterling herself, the CEO and great-granddaughter of the company's founder, when she noticed something that immediately struck her as unusual. A thin strip of warm light was visible under the heavy oak door, even though her security briefing had specifically indicated that the executive floors would be completely empty tonight due to the storm-related early closure. She paused in the hallway, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate actual occupancy rather than simply a forgotten desk lamp. After 18 months of night work in the building, she had developed reliable instincts about Sterling Financial's after-hours rhythms. She knew the difference between offices where someone was actually working late and spaces where lighting had simply been left on accidentally. This felt like a forgotten light, but she couldn't be completely certain without investigating further. "Hello?" Elena called softly, knocking gently on the door with professional courtesy. "Security check. Is anyone working late tonight?" No response came from within the office. Elena tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which was itself unusual since the executive offices were normally secured with electronic locks that required specific keycards for after-hours access. She pushed the door open slowly, poking her head into what is arguably the most impressive office space in all of Sterling Financial. Victoria Sterling's corner office commanded spectacular views of Lake Michigan and downtown Chicago skyline, though tonight the floor-to-ceiling windows revealed nothing but sheets of rain driven against the glass by winds that made the building sway almost imperceptibly.
The office itself was a masterpiece of understated luxury: antique furniture that belonged in a museum, a Persian rug that was probably worth more than Elena's car, and oil paintings of stern-faced company founders who had built their financial empire during Chicago's industrial boom at the turn of the 20th century.
The office was indeed empty, just as Elena had suspected from her hallway assessment, but something was clearly wrong with the scene before her. The normally immaculate space, which Elena had cleaned hundreds of times and which was always maintained in perfect order, showed obvious signs of hasty departure that suggested something unusual had occurred. A coffee cup sat on the antique desk, still warm enough that Elena could smell the rich aroma when she approached. Papers were scattered across the polished mahogany surface in a pattern that suggested urgent activity rather than careful organization. A woman's suit jacket had been flung over the back of a chair as if its owner had suddenly needed to leave but intended to return shortly. More concerning to Elena's trained eye was the condition of the desk itself. One of the drawers had been left partially open and its contents were partly spilled onto the Persian rug below. As someone whose livelihood now depended on maintaining perfect order in executive offices, Elena felt both professional concern about the mess and personal worry that she might somehow be blamed for whatever had caused the disarray. As Elena bent to collect the scattered papers, partly from ingrained professional habit and partly from genuine concern that she might be held responsible for any disorder discovered in the morning, her elbow accidentally knocked against the drawer that hadn't been properly closed. The drawer slid open further, revealing contents that made Elena freeze in place with recognition and growing excitement. An ornate brass key tumbled out of the disturbed drawer, hitting the Persian rug with a metallic sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office. As Elena picked up the key, her breath caught in her throat with the sudden thrill of recognition that she hadn't felt since her research days. Her years of studying medieval and early modern artifacts had trained her to recognize historical craftsmanship and dating clues at a glance, and this key was unlike anything she would have expected to find in a contemporary executive's desk drawer. The key was substantial in both weight and size, perhaps 4 inches long, with an elaborate decorative head worked in a style that Elena immediately identified as European, most likely German or Austrian, from the early to mid-20th century period. The brass had developed the warm, deep patina that came only with decades of age and handling, and the design incorporated heralded elements and decorative flourishes that suggested royal or noble origins rather than commercial manufacture. Elena's expert eye caught details that would have been invisible to most people: the specific technique used in the metalwork, the style of the heraldic symbols, even the particular alloy composition suggested by the metal's color and weight. But what truly captured Elena's attention and sent her pulse racing with familiar academic excitement was the small yellowed piece of paper attached to the key with a delicate chain that had also aged to a warm bronze color. In faded handwriting that appeared to be from the mid-20th century, it read, "Vault 7, Heritage Collection, Family Archives Only." Elena's heart began to pound as her dormant academic instincts fully awakened for the first time in 18 months. This wasn't just any antique key found in a random location. The style, the craftsmanship, the mysterious reference to a heritage collection, the apparent age of both the key and its accompanying note, everything about the discovery suggested a potential connection to exactly the kind of historical artifacts that Elena had spent years studying in her former professional life. In her previous career, finding a key like this would have immediately triggered a comprehensive investigation. She would have researched the building's history, traced the ownership of the company, analyzed the key's manufacture and design elements, and pursued every possible lead to understand its significance and origins. But Elena wasn't Dr. Rodriguez anymore. She was Elena, the night janitor, standing in her employer's private office at midnight, holding what might be evidence of something historically significant, but was definitely none of her business according to the strict boundaries that governed her current position. The rational, responsible thing to do would be to place the key carefully back in the drawer where she had found it, report the unlocked office and scattered papers to building security, finish her assigned cleaning tasks, and go home to catch a few hours of sleep before Miguel woke up for school. But as Elena turned the mysterious key over in her hands, examining the intricate metalwork with eyes trained to notice historical details that others would miss, she felt something awakening in her consciousness that had been dormant for too long. The part of her brain that had once driven her to spend months in European archives pursuing research leads that other scholars had dismissed as unpromising dead ends. The intellectual curiosity that had built her reputation for finding connections that others had overlooked. The part of her identity that had once been so close to solving one of the greatest art mysteries of the 20th century. Elena glanced around Victoria Sterling's empty office, her mind racing as she processed the potential implications of her discovery. Victoria Sterling Financial was one of Chicago's oldest investment firms, founded in the 1920s by European immigrants who had built their considerable fortune during a historical period when many valuable cultural artifacts were finding their way from war-torn Europe to America under circumstances that ranged from legitimate sales to outright smuggling operations.
The timing aligned perfectly with the era Elena had spent years researching. The period when royal collections and noble family treasures had disappeared from Europe and sometimes surfaced decades later in American private collections. And now, in the personal desk of the company's current CEO, Elena had found a key that looked like it belonged in a museum's medieval collection rather than a modern office building. She should put the key back where she found it. She should finish her work and go home to her son. She should forget what she had discovered and focus on the life she was actually living rather than the career she had lost. But the historian in Elena Rodriguez, the part of her professional identity that had never truly died despite 18 months of invisible labor and financial desperation, was fully awake now, humming with the familiar electricity of being on the edge of a potentially significant discovery. For the first time since Miguel's diagnosis had derailed her academic career, Elena felt the thrilling sensation of her expertise being not just relevant, but possibly crucial to understanding something important. Elena slipped the mysterious key into the pocket of her uniform, telling herself she would examine it more carefully at home and return it the following night before anyone noticed it was missing. Just a few hours of harmless intellectual curiosity. What could it hurt to apply her specialized knowledge one more time, even if no one would ever know about her investigation? As Elena left Victoria Sterling's office and continued with her cleaning routine, the brass key felt warm against her leg through the thin fabric of her pocket. She had no idea that the small object she had accidentally discovered would unlock far more than whatever physical vault it was designed to open. It would unlock a mystery that had puzzled historians and law enforcement agencies for decades, expose a conspiracy that had successfully hidden in plain sight for 90 years, and ultimately unlock the door to a professional future that Elena had believed was permanently closed to her. But first, she had floors to mop and wastebaskets to empty. Some things, even in the midst of potentially life-changing historical discoveries, remained frustratingly mundane. The real adventure would begin tomorrow night, when Elena Rodriguez would discover that her expertise in missing royal treasures wasn't as professionally useless as she had been forced to believe, and that sometimes the most extraordinary opportunities come to those who have lost everything else, but retain the curiosity and knowledge to recognize significance when it appears unexpectedly in their path. Elena Rodriguez stared at the ornate brass key lying on her kitchen table as the first light of dawn crept through the windows of her modest apartment in Lincoln Park. The key seemed to absorb the early morning sunlight, its aged patina gleaming with secrets that had been hidden for decades. After finishing her shift at Sterling Financial Tower 4 hours earlier, Elena had been unable to sleep, her mind racing with questions that her dormant academic instincts refused to ignore. Miguel was still asleep in his bedroom, and Elena had at least 3 hours before she needed to wake him for school, 3 precious hours to indulge the intellectual curiosity that had once defined her professional life. She made herself a strong cup of coffee and opened her laptop, a 6-year-old machine that had seen better days but still connected her to the vast digital archives she had once navigated with expert precision. Elena photographed the key from multiple angles, capturing the intricate details of the metalwork under different lighting conditions. Her trained eye cataloged elements that would have been invisible to most people: the specific style of the heraldic eagles worked into the key's head,
the particular technique used in the brass casting, the method by which the decorative elements had been applied to the functional structure. Everything about the key screamed European craftsmanship from the 1940s era, precisely the period when so many cultural treasures had disappeared from the continent. The accompanying note, with its reference to Vault 7 and Heritage Collection, suggested that this wasn't just a decorative antique, but actually a functional key to something significant. Elena's first step was to research Sterling Financial's corporate history, something she should have done months ago out of simple curiosity about her employer. What she discovered in the company's official records was intriguing but unsurprising for a firm of its age and prestige. Sterling Financial had been founded in 1924 by Heinrich Sterling, a German immigrant who had arrived in Chicago with substantial capital and immediately established himself in the city's growing financial sector. According to the sanitized corporate biography available on their website, Heinrich Sterling had been a European investment consultant who specialized in helping wealthy European families diversify their holdings across international markets during the unstable interwar period. The company had grown rapidly during the 1930s and 1940s, establishing itself as one of Chicago's most exclusive wealth management firms, with a client base that included some of America's wealthiest industrial families.
But Elena's academic training had taught her to read between the lines of official corporate histories. The timing of Heinrich Sterling's arrival in America, 1923, just as political and economic conditions in Germany were becoming increasingly unstable, was suspicious enough. More intriguing was the company's rapid growth during the 1930s and 1940s, precisely the period when wealthy Europeans were desperately trying to move assets out of a continent sliding toward war. Elena dug deeper, accessing academic databases that her Northwestern University credentials still allowed her to use. What she found in scholarly articles about wartime financial networks painted a more complex picture of Sterling Financial's origins. Several researchers had identified Heinrich Sterling as one of dozens of European financiers who had established American operations during the interwar period, ostensibly to serve legitimate clients, but potentially to facilitate the movement of questionable assets. A 1987 paper published in the Journal of Economic History mentioned Sterling Financial specifically as one of several firms that had been investigated by federal authorities in the late 1940s for potential connections to Nazi gold operations. The investigation had apparently been dropped due to lack of evidence and political pressure from powerful clients, but Elena's historian instincts were fully engaged now. She expanded her search to focus on Heinrich Sterling personally, and what she discovered made her pulse quicken with recognition. Heinrich Sterling had not simply been a financial consultant in pre-war Germany. According to immigration records that Elena accessed through a genealogy website, he had been employed by the Bavarian State Art Commission from 1920 to 1923, a position that would have given him intimate knowledge of the royal collections housed in Munich's various palaces and museums. Elena nearly choked on her coffee as the implications hit her. Heinrich Sterling had been in a perfect position to know about the Bavarian crown collection that Elena had spent years researching. More than that, he would have had detailed knowledge of the collection's contents, security arrangements, and storage locations. If Elena's theory about wartime smuggling operations was correct, Sterling would have been ideally positioned to facilitate the movement of such treasures to America. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. Elena had accidentally discovered a key in the office of Heinrich Sterling's great-granddaughter, a key that appeared to date from the 1940s and referenced a heritage collection kept in a vault. The key's craftsmanship and design suggested German origins from exactly the period when the Bavarian crown collection had disappeared. Elena spent the next hour researching the Sterling Financial building itself, trying to understand its layout and history. The 52-story tower had been completed in 1962, but it had been built on the site of an earlier Sterling Financial headquarters that dated back to the 1920s.
Most significantly, the building's construction had included extensive basement levels that were unusual for downtown Chicago construction of that era. According to architectural records Elena found in the Chicago Public Library's digital archives, the Sterling Tower's basement extended 5 levels below street level, far deeper than necessary for mechanical systems or parking. The building plans showed a complex underground structure with multiple sublevels, some of which were designated for private client storage and archive preservation. Elena cross-referenced the building plans with city records and discovered something that made her hands shake with excitement. In 1943, Sterling Financial had applied for special permits to construct climate-controlled preservation facilities in the building's basement levels. The permits had been granted without the usual public review process, suggesting political influence or connections that allowed the company to bypass normal regulatory scrutiny. The timeline was perfect. The Bavarian Crown collection had disappeared from Munich in early 1943. Heinrich Sterling, with his intimate knowledge of the collection and his newly established American financial network, would have been in ideal position to arrange for the treasure's secret transport to Chicago. The climate-controlled facilities constructed in 1943 would have provided perfect storage for priceless artifacts that needed to be kept in museum-quality conditions. Elena realized she was holding what might be the key to one of the greatest art mysteries of the 20th century. But she was also holding evidence of what could be the largest cultural theft in American history, hidden in plain sight beneath one of Chicago's most prestigious office buildings. Her academic excitement was tempered by the practical realities of her situation. She was a night janitor, with a criminal record for trespassing if she was caught investigating areas where she didn't belong. She had no authority to pursue this discovery officially, no institutional backing to support her research, and no legal standing to demand access to private corporate facilities. But Elena also knew that if her theory was correct, priceless cultural treasures that belonged in museums were sitting in a basement vault just 2 floors below where she worked every night. Treasures that had been mourned as lost by historians and art lovers for nearly 8 decades. Treasures that could reshape understanding of wartime cultural losses and potentially be returned to their rightful place in human heritage. Elena checked the time, 8:30 a.m. Miguel would be awake soon, and she needed to maintain the normal routine that anchored their carefully constructed life. But first, she needed to make a phone call that could change everything.
Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been Elena's closest colleague during her academic career, a fellow medieval historian who specialized in wartime cultural preservation. Rebecca now held the position at the Art Institute of Chicago that Elena might have had if life had taken a different turn. More importantly, Rebecca was one of the few people who would understand both the historical significance of Elena's potential discovery and the ethical obligation to pursue it regardless of personal risk. "Elena?" Rebecca's voice was warm but surprised when she answered her phone. "This is unexpected. How are you? How's Miguel?" "Miguel's doing well, thank you for asking," Elena replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious about calling her former colleague from her current circumstances. "Rebecca, I need to run something by you, something that might sound crazy but could be incredibly important." Elena outlined her discovery carefully, describing the key, its apparent age and craftsmanship, the timing of Heinrich Sterling's arrival in America, and the suspicious basement construction in 1943. Rebecca listened without interruption, occasionally asking sharp questions that demonstrated she was taking Elena's theory seriously. "My God, Elena," Rebecca said when Elena finished her explanation. "If you're right about this, you've stumbled onto something enormous, the Bavarian Crown collection. Every medievalist has wondered what happened to those pieces. To think they might have been sitting in a Chicago basement for 80 years? "I know it sounds impossible," Elena said, "but everything fits. The timeline, Sterling's background, the building construction, and now this key that appears to be from exactly the right period and references a heritage collection. What do you plan to do? You can't exactly walk into Sterling Financial and demand access to their private vaults based on a theory." Elena had been wrestling with exactly that question.
I have access to the building. My cleaning route includes the basement levels, though not the areas marked as private storage. But I could potentially investigate further, maybe find the vault referenced on the key's tag. Elena, that's incredibly dangerous, Rebecca said, her voice sharp with concern. If you're caught trespassing in restricted areas, you could face criminal charges. You could lose your job, and then what happens to Miguel? I know the risks, Elena replied. But Rebecca, what if I'm right? What if the Bavarian Crown Collection is sitting in that building, accessible with the key I found? Can I really just ignore that possibility? Rebecca was quiet for several moments, and Elena could practically hear her former colleague's mind working through the implications. There might be another way, Rebecca said finally. I have contacts at the FBI's art crime team. If we could present them with enough evidence to justify an investigation, they could pursue this officially. What kind of evidence would they need? Elena asked. More than we have right now, admitted Rebecca. A key and some circumstantial historical connections wouldn't be enough for a warrant. We'd need something more concrete: documentation, photographs, or physical evidence that stolen artifacts are actually present in the building. Elena understood what Rebecca was suggesting without saying it directly. Someone would need to use the key to verify what was in Vault 7 before law enforcement could become involved. Someone with access to the building and the expertise to recognize the significance of whatever they might find. I need to think about this. There's a lot at stake. Elena, Rebecca said softly, I want you to know that if you do decide to pursue this, you won't be alone. This discovery could be the breakthrough that brings you back to the academic world where you belong. The person who recovers the Bavarian Crown Collection would have every major museum in the world competing to hire them. After ending the call, Elena sat in her kitchen, staring at the key while her coffee grew cold. The responsible choice was obvious. Return the key to Victoria Sterling's desk and pretend she had never seen it. Continue her quiet life as a night janitor, pay off Miguel's medical bills gradually, and accept that her academic career was permanently behind her. But Elena knew she couldn't ignore what she had discovered. The historian in her, the part of her professional identity that had never truly died despite 18 months of invisible labor, was fully awake now and demanding action. Elena spent the rest of the morning researching building schematics and security procedures for Sterling Financial Tower. As an employee with basement access, she had legitimate reasons to be in the lower levels of the building, though venturing into areas marked as private storage would be a clear violation of her employment terms. The building's basement levels were complex, with multiple subsections designated for different purposes. Levels B1 and B2 housed mechanical systems and general storage. Levels B3 contained the parking garage and looting docks, but levels B4 and B5 were marked on building plans as private client facilities with restricted access. Elena had cleaned areas of B1 and B2 as part of her regular duties, but she had never had reason to venture to the deeper basement levels. According to the building directory she studied online, B4 and B5 required special elevator access and were governed by different security protocols than the rest of the building. The key's tag had specified Vault 7, which suggested there were at least 6 other similar storage facilities in the building. Elena cross-referenced the building plans with the corporate directory and discovered that Sterling Financial offered heritage preservation services to their wealthiest clients, essentially functioning as a private museum storage facility for families that owned significant art collections.
The legitimate business model provided perfect cover for hiding stolen artifacts. If Heinrich Sterling had smuggled European treasures to Chicago in the 1940s, establishing a legal preservation service would allow the company to maintain and display the stolen pieces without attracting suspicion.
Clients and visitors would assume any impressive artifacts they saw were part of the company's legitimate business operations. Elena realized she was looking at a nearly perfect crime. The stolen treasures would be hidden in plain sight, protected by corporate security and legitimate business operations, accessible only to family members who knew the truth about their origins. For nearly 80 years, the Sterling family had probably been using their inherited expertise to build an empire partially founded on one of history's greatest cultural thefts. By early afternoon, Elena had made her decision. She would use the key to investigate Vault 7, but she would do it carefully and professionally. If she found evidence of stolen artifacts, she would document everything thoroughly and present the evidence to Rebecca's FBI contacts. If the vault contained nothing significant, she would return the key and consider the matter closed. Elena spent Miguel's after-school hours helping him with homework and preparing dinner, maintaining the normal routine that anchored their life together. But her mind was already planning the night's investigation, mentally reviewing building layouts and considering the practical challenges of accessing restricted areas without triggering security alerts. "Mom, you seem distracted today," Miguel observed over dinner. At 13, he had developed the perceptiveness that often comes with surviving serious illness. "Is everything okay at work?" Elena looked at her son, healthy, curious, trusting, and felt the weight of what she was contemplating. If she was caught investigating restricted areas of Sterling Financial, she would lose the job that provided their health insurance and financial stability. Miguel's continued health depended on regular medical monitoring that their insurance covered. But Elena also thought about the lessons she wanted to teach her son about courage, integrity, and the responsibility that comes with knowledge. How could she explain to Miguel that she had discovered evidence of one of history's greatest cultural thefts and chosen to ignore it out of personal convenience? "Work is fine, sweetheart," Elena said, reaching across the table to squeeze Miguel's hand. "I'm just thinking through a problem that might have an interesting solution." "Are you going to tell me about it?" Miguel asked, with the direct curiosity of adolescence. Elena smiled at her son's question. "Maybe soon. Right now, I need to do some research to make sure I understand the problem correctly." That night, Elena arrived at Sterling Financial Tower with her usual cleaning supplies and her normal professional demeanor. But hidden in her pocket, alongside the mysterious brass key, was her smartphone equipped with a high-resolution camera and extra battery packs. If she was going to investigate Vault 7, she would document everything she found with the thoroughness that her academic training demanded. Elena began her shift with her normal routine, cleaning the upper floors systematically while mentally reviewing her plan for the evening's investigation. She would complete her regular duties first, establishing normal patterns for any security monitoring before venturing into the restricted basement levels during the quietest hours of the night. At 2:30 a.m., when the building was as empty and quiet as it would ever be, Elena guided her cleaning cart into the service elevator and pressed the button for level B4. Her employee key card granted access to the elevator, but she had no idea whether it would allow her into the restricted storage areas once she reached the basement level. The elevator descended past the familiar levels where Elena had worked for 18 months, into depths of the building she had never seen. When the doors opened on B4, Elena found herself in a corridor that looked more like a museum storage facility than a typical office building. The walls were lined with climate control systems and humidity monitors. Soft lighting illuminated displays of what appeared to be significant artworks and historical artifacts. Elena realized she was looking at Sterling Financial's Heritage Preservation Services in operation, a legitimate business that provided perfect cover for hiding stolen treasures among legally acquired pieces. Elena moved through the corridor carefully, noting the sophisticated security systems and preservation equipment that rivaled anything she had seen in major museums. Each vault door was marked with a number and equipped with both electronic locks and traditional key access. Elena passed Vault 1 through Vault 6, each sealed and bearing small brass plaques indicating they were private client storage.
At the end of the corridor, Elena found Vault 7. The door was imposing, solid steel with brass fittings that matched the style of the key in her pocket. Above the electronic lock panel was a traditional keyhole that appeared to be the exact size and shape for the ornate key she had discovered in Victoria Sterling's desk. Her hands were shaking slightly as she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with surprising smoothness, as if the mechanism had been recently maintained and oiled. There was a soft click, followed by the quiet hum of electronic systems disengaging. The vault door swung open silently, revealing a climate-controlled chamber that took Elena's breath away.
She was looking at a treasure room that belonged in the world's greatest museums. Display cases lined the walls, each containing artifacts that Elena's expert eye immediately recognized as museum-quality pieces from medieval and early modern Europe. Crowns, scepters, ceremonial jewelry, religious artifacts, and decorative objects that represented centuries of European craftsmanship and artistic achievement. But it was the central display case that made Elena's knees weak with recognition and disbelief. There, arranged with museum-quality precision and preservation, were the unmistakable components of the Bavarian crown collection. The pieces Elena had spent years researching, had written papers about, had assumed were lost forever in the chaos of World War II. The Bavarian electoral crown, with its distinctive arched design and emerald inlays that medieval chroniclers had described in reverent detail. The ceremonial scepter topped with the legendary Bavarian blue diamond that had been considered one of Europe's most significant gems. The coronation ring that had been worn by Holy Roman emperors for over 3 centuries. Elena recognized every piece from historical descriptions and the few surviving photographs taken before the collection's disappearance. These were undoubtedly the authentic artifacts that had vanished from Munich in 1943, sitting in a Chicago basement for 80 years while the world mourned them as lost forever. Elena began photographing everything she could access with methodical thoroughness, her academic training taking over as she documented what might be the most significant art recovery of the modern era. Each photo was carefully composed to capture identifying details, craftsmanship elements, and condition assessments that would be crucial for authentication. As she worked, Elena noticed something else that sent chills down her spine. Displayed alongside the Bavarian collection were artifacts that appeared to be from other missing European collections. Pieces that Elena recognized from her research into wartime cultural losses, treasures that had disappeared from France, Austria, and other countries during the chaos of World War II. Vault 7 wasn't just hiding the Bavarian crown collection, it was concealing multiple stolen collections representing one of the largest accumulations of missing cultural artifacts that Elena had ever encountered. The Sterling family hadn't just facilitated one theft, they had apparently operated an entire network for moving stolen European treasures to American hiding places. Elena photographed everything she could access, working with the systematic thoroughness that had made her reputation as a researcher. She documented not just the artifacts themselves, but also the storage conditions, preservation methods, and any visible documentation or labels that might provide additional evidence about the collection's origins and acquisition. After nearly an hour in Vault 7, Elena had documented over 100 individual artifacts, including complete photographic records of the entire Bavarian crown collection. She had evidence that would revolutionize understanding of wartime cultural losses and potentially lead to the recovery of dozens of other missing treasures. But Elena also realized she was now in possession of what is probably the largest art theft in American history, hidden beneath one of Chicago's most prestigious financial institutions. The Sterling family had built their empire partially on stolen cultural heritage, and they had maintained the secret for 8 decades. As Elena carefully secured the vault and returned to her normal cleaning duties, her mind raced with the implications of what she had discovered. She had found the evidence that could bring her back to the academic world where she belonged, but she had also uncovered a conspiracy that would destroy one of Chicago's most powerful families and potentially implicate numerous wealthy collectors who might have unknowingly purchased stolen artifacts. Elena finished her shift as dawn broke over Chicago, the weight of discovery and responsibility heavy on her shoulders. In her pocket, alongside the brass key that had started everything, was a smartphone containing photographic evidence that would change her life forever. The janitor who had accidentally discovered a 90-year-old secret was about to become the historian who exposed one of the greatest cultural crimes of the modern era. But first, she had to figure out how to present her evidence without destroying the fragile stability she had built for Miguel and herself. Some discoveries, Elena was learning, came with prices that extended far beyond personal ambition. The real challenge would be finding a way to do the right thing for history while protecting the life she had built from the ruins of her former dreams. Elena Rodriguez sat in her car outside Miguel's school, hands trembling as she scrolled through the hundreds of photographs on her phone. The afternoon sun streamed through the windshield, but she barely noticed the warmth. The images on her screen represented evidence of what could be the largest art theft recovery in modern history, and she was the only person in the world who knew the truth. The Bavarian crown collection wasn't just intact, it was perfectly preserved in museum-quality conditions alongside artifacts from at least 6 other European noble families that had been reported missing since World War II. Elena had inadvertently stumbled upon what appeared to be a sophisticated network of cultural smuggling that had operated for 8 decades under the cover of legitimate business operations.
But as Elena studied the photographs with her trained historian's eye, she began to notice details that made the discovery even more significant than she had initially realized. This wasn't just a cache of stolen artifacts hidden away in a basement vault. Someone had been actively maintaining, cataloging, and even displaying these treasures with professional museum standards. Each artifact in Vault 7 had been accompanied by detailed preservation documentation, authentication certificates, and what appeared to be scholarly research notes. Elena zoomed in on photographs she had taken of these documents, squinting to read the faded handwriting and typed notes that revealed a disturbing pattern of organized scholarship surrounding the stolen collections. The documentation suggested that the Sterling family hadn't simply hidden stolen artifacts for 8 decades. They had been actively studying them, cataloging their historical significance, and maintaining detailed records of their authenticity and provenance. More disturbingly, some of the research notes appeared to reference sales and acquisitions, suggesting that pieces from the collection had been quietly sold to private collectors over the years. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Mom, soccer practice is over. Where are you?" She quickly responded that she was on her way and slipped the phone into her purse, but her mind continued racing as she walked toward the school's athletic fields. Miguel bounded over to her with the boundless energy of a healthy 13-year-old, his soccer cleats plicking against the pavement. "How was work last night?" he asked as they walked toward Elena's car. "You seemed pretty tired this morning." Elena looked at her son, the reason she had sacrificed her academic career, the person whose health and stability mattered more than any historical discovery, and felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her shoulders. How could she explain that she had uncovered evidence of one of history's greatest cultural crimes while emptying waste baskets for minimum wage? "Work was, interesting," Elena said carefully. "I might have found something that connects to my old research." Miguel's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Really? Like medieval stuff? That's so cool, Mom. I always wondered why you stopped studying all that historical detective work." Elena smiled at her son's enthusiasm, remembering the little boy who had once loved hearing stories about knights and castles and lost treasures. "Maybe I'll tell you more about it soon. Right now, I need to figure out if what I found is as important as I think it might be." That evening, Elena called Rebecca Martinez again, this time with a careful selection of the photographs she had taken in Vault 7. She couldn't reveal how she had obtained the images, but she could share enough evidence to confirm that her theory about the Bavarian crown collection had been correct. "Elena, these photographs are extraordinary," Rebecca breathed over the phone. "The detail, the condition of the pieces. This is definitely the authentic Bavarian collection. I can see craftsmanship details that have never been documented in any surviving records." "There's more," Elena said carefully. "Much more. The collection appears to be part of a larger accumulation of artifacts from multiple European sources. I count at least 7 different noble families represented in what I was able to document." Rebecca was quiet for several moments, processing the implications. "Elena, what you're describing sounds like the largest recovery of missing wartime artifacts in history. This isn't just about the Bavarian collection anymore.
You've potentially found evidence of an entire smuggling network that operated during and after World War II. Elena had reached the same conclusion during her afternoon analysis of the photographs. The artifacts in Vault 7 represented treasures from across Europe, German, Austrian, French, and Italian noble collections that all disappeared during the war years. The coordination required to move so many significant pieces from different countries suggested an organized operation rather than opportunistic looting. Rebecca, I need to understand the legal implications of this discovery. If these artifacts were stolen during the war, who has legitimate claim to them now? The countries they were taken from? The noble families who originally owned them? The museums where they were housed? That's complicated, Rebecca replied. International law regarding wartime cultural losses has evolved significantly since the 1990s. There are specific protocols for returning artifacts to their countries of origin, but proving theft and establishing legitimate ownership can be incredibly complex, especially when pieces have been missing for 8 decades. Rebecca paused, and Elena could hear papers rustling in the background. The important thing is that, under federal law, possession of stolen cultural property is a serious crime, regardless of how long the artifacts have been hidden. If you can prove these pieces were taken illegally, current possession becomes irrelevant. Elena understood the implication. The Sterling family's decades of secretive ownership wouldn't protect them from prosecution if the artifacts could be proven stolen. But proving theft would require more than just Elena's word and some surreptitious photographs.
What kind of evidence would federal investigators need to pursue this officially? Elena asked. Ideally, they'd want documentation proving the artifact's original ownership, evidence of the theft itself, and proof that the current holders know the items are stolen, Rebecca explained. Your photographs are a good start, but investigators would need access to the actual artifacts for authentication and examination. Elena realized she was facing a crucial decision point. The evidence she had gathered was compelling, but not conclusive enough to guarantee federal intervention. To build a stronger case, she would need to return to Vault 7 and document not just the artifacts themselves, but also the accompanying paperwork that might prove knowledge of their stolen status. But returning to the vault meant taking even greater risks. Elena had been lucky that her first investigation had gone undetected, but pushing her luck could result in discovery, criminal charges, and the loss of everything she had worked to rebuild after Miguel's illness. Over the next 3 days, Elena researched everything she could find about wartime art theft and recovery operations. She studied case histories of other major discoveries, learning about the legal processes and international cooperation required to return stolen cultural property to its rightful owners. What she learned both encouraged and terrified her. The encouraging news was that international law strongly favored returning stolen wartime artifacts to their countries of origin, regardless of how much time had passed or how much money current owners had paid for them. Recent high-profile cases had established clear precedents for recovery and repatriation of even single artifacts, let alone entire collections. The terrifying news was that major art theft cases typically took years to resolve and often involved international lawsuits, complex authentication processes, and enormous legal expenses. Elena would be starting a process that could consume the rest of her life and potentially expose her to retaliation from some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in America. Elena also researched the Sterling family's current business operations and discovered that Victoria Sterling was even more powerful and well-connected than Elena had realized. Sterling Financial managed investment portfolios for billionaires, political figures, and major cultural institutions. Victoria herself served on the boards of 3 major museums and was a significant donor to political campaigns across the country. If Elena's accusations were proven correct, the scandal would destroy not just the Sterling family, but potentially implicate dozens of their clients and associates who might have unknowingly purchased stolen artifacts over the decades.
The political and financial ramifications would be enormous, affecting some of the most influential people in American society. But Elena also discovered something that strengthened her resolve to pursue the investigation despite the risks. In her research into wartime cultural losses, she found heartbreaking accounts from European families and communities who had lost irreplaceable pieces of their heritage during the war. Survivors of the Nazi period who had spent their entire lives grieving for cultural treasures they assumed had been destroyed forever. One particular account stayed with Elena long after she read it. An elderly German historian named Dr. Klaus Weber had dedicated his career to documenting the Bavarian Crown collection, keeping alive the memory of artifacts he had studied as a young scholar before their disappearance. Dr. Weber had died just 2 years earlier, never knowing that the treasures he had mourned for 8 decades were sitting in a Chicago basement, perfectly preserved but hidden from the world. Elena realized that her discovery wasn't just about exposing a crime or recovering valuable artifacts. It was about returning pieces of cultural identity to communities that had been robbed of their heritage. The artifacts in Vault 7 didn't belong to the Sterling family or to private collectors. They belonged to humanity, to the museums and institutions that would ensure they could be studied, appreciated, and preserved for future generations. On Friday evening, as Elena prepared for another weekend with Miguel, she made her decision. She would return to Vault 7, but this time she would document everything she could find, not just the artifacts themselves, but also any paperwork, authentication documents, or records that might prove the Sterling family's knowledge of the collection's stolen status. Elena spent Saturday with Miguel at the Art Institute of Chicago, ostensibly for a fun family outing, but actually to refresh her memory of proper museum documentation standards. As they walked through the medieval art galleries, Elena pointed out details of craftsmanship and historical significance, sharing her expertise with her son for the first time since her career had ended. "Mom, you know so much about all this stuff. Why did you stop working with museums? This seems like exactly what you should be doing." Elena looked at the medieval crown behind glass, thinking about the far more significant treasures hidden beneath Sterling Financial Tower. Sometimes life takes you in directions you don't expect, but maybe there are second chances for people who know how to recognize them.
Elena began her shift with meticulous attention to her normal cleaning routine, establishing regular patterns that would make her eventual absence from the upper floors seem like part of standard basement maintenance activities. At 2:15 a.m., she made her way to the service elevator and descended to level B4. This time, Elena approached Vault 7 with a systematic methodology of her academic training. She had prepared a checklist of documentation priorities and brought better equipment for photographing detailed text documents in low-light conditions. The vault opened just as smoothly as before, revealing the treasure room that Elena now understood represented one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. But this time, instead of being overwhelmed by the spectacle of the artifacts themselves, Elena focused on the administrative materials that accompanied each collection. What she found exceeded her worst fears about the Sterling family's knowledge and complicity. Filing cabinets along the vault's walls contained decades of correspondence between Heinrich Sterling and his descendants with European art dealers, private collectors, and even museum officials. Letters dating back to the 1940s discussed the acquisition of specific pieces, their authentication, and their eventual sale or trade to American collectors. Elena photographed letter after letter that documented a sophisticated network of cultural smuggling that had operated for decades. Heinrich Sterling had apparently maintained detailed records of every transaction, including correspondence with Nazi officials, Swiss bank representatives, and American customs officials who had been bribed to allow undeclared cultural artifacts into the country. More disturbing were recent documents that showed the current generation of the Sterling family was fully aware of their inheritance's criminal origins. Victoria Sterling had received detailed briefings about the collection's provenance when she assumed control of the company 15 years earlier.
Internal memoranda discuss strategies for gradually selling pieces to private collectors while maintaining plausible deniability about their stolen status. Elena found evidence that over the past 2 decades, the Sterling family had quietly sold dozens of artifacts from the hidden collections to wealthy Americans who wanted impressive pieces for their private museums. The buyers apparently didn't ask difficult questions about provenance as long as the artifacts came with convincing authentication documentation that the Sterling family had been forging for decades. But the most shocking discovery came when Elena found correspondence from just 6 months earlier between Victoria Sterling and representatives of a Swiss auction house. The letters discussed plans to gradually liquidate the remaining collections over the next 5 years, selling the artifacts through Swiss intermediaries to buyers in countries with less stringent cultural property laws. Elena realized she had uncovered evidence of not just a historical crime, but an ongoing criminal enterprise. The Sterling family wasn't just hiding stolen artifacts, they were actively selling them to private collectors while the world continued to mourn these treasures as lost forever. Elena photographed every document she could find, working methodically through filing cabinets that contained 8 decades of incriminating correspondence. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed records of the original thefts, decades of hidden storage and maintenance, ongoing sales to private collectors, and current plans to liquidate the collections before international pressure for art repatriation could threaten their operation. As Elena worked, she began to understand the true scope of what Heinrich Sterling had accomplished. He hadn't just stolen a few valuable artifacts during wartime chaos. He had established an entire business model based on cultural theft, creating a network that had operated successfully for 8 decades while maintaining the facade of legitimate wealth management services. The Sterling family had built their fortune not just by managing money for wealthy clients, but by selling them stolen cultural treasures disguised as legitimate acquisitions. Their client base of billionaires and influential families had unknowingly become complicit in one of history's longest-running art theft operations. Elena spent nearly 3 hours in Vault 7, documenting everything she could access. When she finally secured the vault and returned to her normal cleaning duties, she carried on her phone evidence that would not only prove the largest art theft in American history, but also implicate dozens of wealthy collectors and potentially several major museums that might have unknowingly acquired stolen pieces. But Elena also realized that her evidence now made her incredibly dangerous to some of the most powerful people in America. The Sterling family and their clients had billions of dollars at stake in keeping the truth about the collections hidden. Once Elena presented her evidence to federal investigators, she would be taking on adversaries with unlimited resources and political connections that extended to the highest levels of American society. As dawn broke over Chicago and Elena drove home from her shift, she understood that she had crossed a point of no return. The evidence on her phone was too significant to ignore, but presenting it would mean abandoning the quiet, stable life she had built for Miguel and herself.
Elena had discovered not just stolen artifacts, but an ongoing criminal enterprise that threatened to destroy some of America's wealthiest families and most prestigious cultural institutions. The janitor, who had accidentally found an antique key, was about to expose a conspiracy that would reshape understanding of wartime cultural losses and potentially trigger the largest art recovery operation in history. But first, she had to find a way to present her evidence safely, without exposing herself and Miguel to retaliation from people who had successfully hidden their crimes for 8 decades. The real challenge was just beginning. Monday morning brought the call that would change Elena Rodriguez's life forever. She was making breakfast for Miguel when her phone rang, displaying an unknown number with a federal area code. "Miss Rodriguez? This is Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's art crime team. Dr. Rebecca Martinez contacted us about some evidence you may have regarding stolen cultural artifacts. Could we arrange a meeting as soon as possible?" Elena's heart hammered as she agreed to meet Agent Chen that afternoon at the federal building downtown. Rebecca had apparently presented enough preliminary evidence to trigger an official investigation,
But Elena knew that everything would depend on how convincingly she could present her case without revealing the illegal method she had used to gather evidence. After dropping Miguel at school, Elena spent the morning organizing her photographs and documentation into a coherent presentation. She had over 800 images from her 2 visits to Vault 7, plus detailed research into Heinrich Sterling's background and the Sterling family's current operations. The evidence was overwhelming, but Elena needed to find a way to present it without admitting to criminal trespassing. At 2 p.m., Elena sat across from Agent Chen in a sterile conference room at the Federal Building. Agent Chen was younger than Elena had expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and the focused intensity of someone who specialized in complex international cases. Dr. Martinez has shared some preliminary information about your background and potential discovery. She indicated you may have evidence related to missing European artifacts from the World War II period. Elena had rehearsed this moment, but actually presenting her case to a federal agent felt surreal after 18 months of invisible labor as a night janitor. I believe I've located the Bavarian crown collection, along with artifacts from multiple other European noble families that disappeared during the war. Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a significant claim. The Bavarian collection has been missing for 80 years. What evidence do you have? Elena opened her laptop and began presenting the photographs, starting with the most clearly identifiable pieces from the Bavarian collection. Agent Chen leaned forward, studying the images with obvious expertise. "These photographs are remarkable," Agent Chen said after reviewing several dozen images. "The detail and condition suggest these artifacts have been professionally preserved. Where exactly were these photographs taken?" This was the moment Elena had been dreading. "The artifacts are located in a private storage facility beneath Sterling Financial Tower in downtown Chicago. I discovered them while conducting historical research into the building's historical connections to wartime art movements." Agent Chen studied Elena carefully. "Miss Rodriguez, I need to understand exactly how you gained access to these artifacts. Private storage facilities typically have sophisticated security systems." Elena chose her words carefully. "I have legitimate access to Sterling Financial Tower as an employee. While conducting historical research into the company's founders, I discovered evidence suggesting connections to missing European collections. This led me to investigate further and locate the storage facility. It wasn't technically alive, but Elena knew she was walking a fine line between cooperation and confession to criminal trespassing. Agent Chen seemed to sense there was more to the story, but she continued reviewing the evidence Elena presented. "Miss Rodriguez, if these photographs are authentic, you've potentially discovered the largest recovery of missing wartime artifacts in modern history. But I need to understand the legal basis for any investigation. How did you gain access to secured private storage areas?" Before Elena could answer, Agent Chen's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. She glanced at the screen and her expression changed immediately. "Miss Rodriguez, I need you to wait here for a moment. Don't leave the building." Agent Chen stepped out of the conference room, leaving Elena alone with her laptop and mounting anxiety. 20 minutes later, Agent Chen returned with 2 additional federal agents and an expression of barely controlled urgency. "Miss Rodriguez, we've just received intelligence that Sterling Financial is planning to move a large quantity of valuable assets out of their building tonight. Our sources suggest this may be related to the artifacts you've documented. We need to act immediately." Elena's blood ran cold. "Someone knows about my investigation?" "We're not sure how, but Victoria Sterling apparently received information that their private storage areas may have been compromised. She's ordered an emergency relocation of what our surveillance indicates are the exact artifacts you photographed." Agent Chen leaned across the table. "Miss Rodriguez, we need your help. You know the building's layout and you have access credentials. We can get a warrant to search the premises, but if the artifacts are moved before we can secure them, this entire investigation becomes infinitely more complicated."
Elena understood the implication. This was her chance to ensure the stolen treasures were recovered and returned to their rightful place in human heritage. But it also meant putting herself at enormous personal risk by actively cooperating with the federal investigation against one of Chicago's most powerful families. "What do you need me to do?" Elena asked. Agent Chen outlined the plan quickly. Federal agents would position themselves around Sterling Financial Tower, while Elena provided real-time intelligence about any movement of artifacts from the basement storage areas. If the Sterling family attempted to remove the collections, Elena would signal the agents who would then execute the warrant and secure the evidence. "Miss Rodriguez, I want to be clear about the risks," Agent Chen said. "If Victoria Sterling realizes you're the source of this investigation, you could face serious retaliation. The Sterling family has enormous resources and political connections." Elena thought about Miguel, about the stable life she had built from the ruins of her academic career, about the medical bills she was still paying and the job she couldn't afford to lose. Then she thought about Dr. Klaus Weber, who had died, never knowing the treasures he mourned were perfectly preserved in a Chicago basement. She thought about all the European families and communities who had lost pieces of their cultural identity to wartime theft. "I understand the risks," Elena said. "These artifacts belong in museums, not private collections. I won't let them disappear again." That evening, Elena arrived at Sterling Financial Tower for what might be her final shift as a night janitor. Federal agents were positioned discreetly around the building, and Elena carried a communication device that would allow her to coordinate with Agent Chen's team. Elena began her shift normally, but within an hour she noticed unusual activity in the building. Security guards were moving through areas they typically avoided, and several elevators were running on restricted access modes. At 11:30 p.m., Elena saw the first clear sign that her worst fears were justified. A convoy of unmarked trucks had arrived at the building's loading dock, and teams of movers were preparing equipment that looked designed for transporting valuable artifacts. Elena immediately contacted Agent Chen. "They're here," Elena whispered into her communication device. "Professional art movers with climate-controlled transport containers. This is definitely an emergency relocation." "Stay in position and keep us informed," Agent Chen replied. "We're ready to move as soon as we have confirmation they're removing the artifacts you documented." Elena positioned herself where she could observe the basement levels without being detected. At midnight, she watched as Victoria Sterling herself arrived at the building, accompanied by several men who looked like private security rather than typical Sterling Financial employees. Elena had never seen Victoria Sterling in person before, and she was struck by how different the CEO looked under stress. The composed executive who appeared in business magazines was replaced by a woman who moved with the urgency of someone whose life's work was collapsing around her. Elena followed the group at a distance as they descended to level B4. She watched from a concealed position as Victoria Sterling opened Vault 7 with her own key and began directing the removal of the artifacts Elena had documented just days earlier. "Agent Chen, they're in the vault. Victoria Sterling is personally overseeing the removal of the collections. They're loading everything into specialized transport containers." "Confirmed. We're moving in now. Miss Rodriguez, please remain in a safe location until we've secured the scene." Elena watched from her hiding place as FBI agents flooded into the basement levels of Sterling Financial Tower. The confrontation was swift and professional, with agents presenting their warrant and immediately securing the area around Vault 7. Victoria Sterling's reaction was a mixture of rage and resignation. Elena could hear her voice echoing through the basement corridors as she demanded to speak with her attorneys and insisted that the artifacts were legitimate family property. "These items have been in my family's possession for generations. We have complete documentation of their acquisition and ownership. Miss Sterling, we have evidence suggesting these artifacts were stolen from European collections during World War II. You will have opportunity to present your documentation, but right now we're securing potential evidence of international art theft." Elena remained hidden until the initial confrontation was resolved and the FBI had taken control of Vault 7. Only then did she emerge from concealment and approach Agent Chen. "Miss Rodriguez, thank you for your cooperation. Your evidence and assistance have been crucial to this operation." Victoria Sterling's eyes fixed on Elena with immediate recognition and fury. "You," she said, her voice filled with venom. "You're the cleaning woman. You stole from my office." Elena met Victoria Sterling's gaze without flinching. "I found evidence of cultural theft that has been hidden for 80 years.
These artifacts belong in museums, not private vaults. You have no idea what you've done, Victoria Sterling said. My family built this company, employed thousands of people, supported museums and cultural institutions across the country. You've destroyed all of that for some medieval trinkets that no one has missed for decades.
Elena felt a surge of anger at Victoria Sterling's dismissive attitude toward priceless cultural heritage. These aren't trinkets, they're irreplaceable pieces of human history that were stolen from their rightful owners. Families and communities have grieved for these treasures for 80 years, while your family profited from their theft. The confrontation was interrupted as FBI agents continued documenting and removing artifacts from Vault 7. Elena watched with a mixture of satisfaction and awe as the Bavarian Crown Collection was carefully loaded into proper museum transport containers, beginning its journey back to the light after 80 decades in darkness. Over the next 6 hours, federal agents documented and removed over 300 individual artifacts from Vault 7 and 6 other storage areas in the Sterling Financial Building. The scope of the recovery exceeded even Elena's expectations, representing collections from a dozen European noble families and cultural institutions. As dawn broke over Chicago, Elena found herself in the surreal position of being interviewed by FBI agents, news reporters, and art historians who had rushed to the scene. The night janitor who had accidentally discovered an antique key was suddenly the center of international attention as news of the recovery spread around the world. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived at the scene as the investigation continued, bringing with her several other art historians who could provide expertise in authenticating and cataloging the recovered artifacts. "Elena, what you've accomplished here is extraordinary," Rebecca said, embracing her former colleague. "This is the largest recovery of missing wartime artifacts in history. You've rewritten the book on cultural theft and recovery." But Elena's attention was focused on a group of elderly men and women who had arrived from Europe overnight after learning of the discovery. These were descendants of the families whose collections had been stolen, people who had grown up hearing stories about treasures their grandparents had lost during the war. Elena watched as an elderly German woman approached the transport container holding the Bavarian Crown Collection, tears streaming down her face as she saw artifacts her family had assumed were lost forever. "Mein Gott," the woman whispered in German, "Die Krone meiner Vorfahren, the crown of my ancestors." Elena realized that her discovery wasn't just about recovering valuable artifacts or exposing a criminal conspiracy. It was about returning pieces of cultural identity to communities that had been robbed of their heritage. The artifacts were going home after 80 years in exile. The legal aftermath of Elena's discovery unfolded over the following months with the swift efficiency of international cooperation in cultural repatriation cases. Victoria Sterling and several other Sterling family members were indicted on federal charges of possession of stolen cultural property, conspiracy to sell stolen artifacts, and money laundering. The evidence Elena had documented proved crucial to the prosecution's case. The decades of correspondence she had photographed showed clear knowledge that the artifacts were stolen, and the ongoing sales to private collectors demonstrated continuing criminal activity rather than just historical wrongdoing. More significantly, the investigation triggered a massive international effort to trace other artifacts that had been sold through the Sterling network over the decades. FBI agents worked with law enforcement agencies across Europe and international art recovery organizations to identify and recover dozens of additional stolen pieces that had been sold to private collectors. The personal transformation in Elena's life was equally dramatic. Within weeks of the discovery, Elena received job offers from major museums around the world. The Art Institute of Chicago offered her a position as senior curator of medieval European collections, with a mandate to establish a new program focused on identifying and recovering missing cultural artifacts. Northwestern University invited Elena to return as a faculty member, offering her a tenured position in their history department with research funding to continue investigating wartime cultural losses. Several international museums expressed interest in collaborative projects that would utilize Elena's expertise and methodology. But the offer that meant the most to Elena came from an unexpected source.
The German government, working with international heritage organizations, invited Elena to lead a new international center for cultural recovery, based in Munich but with operations around the world. The position would allow her to continue the work she had accidentally begun in a Chicago basement, helping to reunite stolen cultural artifacts with their rightful owners. 3 months after her discovery, Elena stood in the Bavarian State Museum in Munich, watching as the Bavarian Crown collection was displayed to the public for the first time since 1943. The artifacts that had been hidden in darkness for 80 decades now gleamed under museum lighting, surrounded by visitors who marveled at treasures they had assumed were lost forever. Miguel stood beside his mother, wearing a suit for the museum's official reopening ceremony. At 13, he was old enough to understand the historical significance of what his mother had accomplished, and Elena could see pride in his eyes as he watched dignitaries from around the world praise her work. "Mom," Miguel said quietly as they stood before the magnificent Bavarian electoral crown, "are you glad you found that key?" Elena smiled at her son's question, thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the most important discoveries come when we're not looking for them, but you have to be brave enough to recognize them when they appear.
Elena had discovered not just stolen artifacts, but an ongoing criminal enterprise that threatened to destroy some of America's wealthiest families and most prestigious cultural institutions. The janitor, who had accidentally found an antique key, was about to expose a conspiracy that would reshape understanding of wartime cultural losses and potentially trigger the largest art recovery operation in history. But first, she had to find a way to present her evidence safely, without exposing herself and Miguel to retaliation from people who had successfully hidden their crimes for 8 decades. The real challenge was just beginning. Monday morning brought the call that would change Elena Rodriguez's life forever. She was making breakfast for Miguel when her phone rang, displaying an unknown number with a federal area code. "Miss Rodriguez? This is Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's art crime team. Dr. Rebecca Martinez contacted us about some evidence you may have regarding stolen cultural artifacts. Could we arrange a meeting as soon as possible?" Elena's heart hammered as she agreed to meet Agent Chen that afternoon at the federal building downtown. Rebecca had apparently presented enough preliminary evidence to trigger an official investigation, but Elena knew that everything would depend on how convincingly she could present her case without revealing the illegal method she had used to gather evidence. After dropping Miguel at school, Elena spent the morning organizing her photographs and documentation into a coherent presentation. She had over 800 images from her 2 visits to Vault 7, plus detailed research into Heinrich Sterling's background and the Sterling family's current operations. The evidence was overwhelming, but Elena needed to find a way to present it without admitting to criminal trespassing. At 2 p.m., Elena sat across from Agent Chen in a sterile conference room at the federal building. Agent Chen was younger than Elena had expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and the focused intensity of someone who specialized in complex international cases. "Dr. Martinez has shared some preliminary information about your background and potential discovery. She indicated you may have evidence related to missing European artifacts from the World War II period." Elena had rehearsed this moment, but actually presenting her case to a federal agent felt surreal after 18 months of invisible labor as a night janitor. "I believe I've located the Bavarian Crown collection, along with artifacts from multiple other European noble families that disappeared during the war." Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a significant claim. The Bavarian collection has been missing for 80 years. What evidence do you have?" Elena opened her laptop and began presenting the photographs, starting with the most clearly identifiable pieces from the Bavarian collection. Agent Chen leaned forward, studying the images with obvious expertise. "These photographs are remarkable," Agent Chen said after reviewing several dozen images. "The detail and condition suggest these artifacts have been professionally preserved. Where exactly were these photographs taken?" This was the moment Elena had been dreading. "The artifacts are located in a private storage facility beneath Sterling Financial Tower in downtown Chicago. I discovered them while conducting historical research into the building's historical connections to wartime art movements."
Agent Chen studied Elena carefully. Miss Rodriguez, I need to understand exactly how you gained access to these artifacts. Private storage facilities typically have sophisticated security systems. Elena chose her words carefully. I have legitimate access to Sterling Financial Tower as an employee. While conducting historical research into the company's founders, I discovered evidence suggesting connections to missing European collections. This led me to investigate further and locate the storage facility. It wasn't technically alive, but Elena knew she was walking a fine line between cooperation and confession to criminal trespassing. Agent Chen seemed to sense there was more to the story, but she continued reviewing the evidence Elena presented. Miss Rodriguez, if these photographs are authentic, you've potentially discovered the largest recovery of missing wartime artifacts in modern history. But I need to understand the legal basis for any investigation. How did you gain access to secured private storage areas? Before Elena could answer, Agent Chen's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. She glanced at the screen and her expression changed immediately. Miss Rodriguez, I need you to wait here for a moment. Don't leave the building. Agent Chen stepped out of the conference room, leaving Elena alone with her laptop and mounting anxiety. 20 minutes later, Agent Chen returned with 2 additional federal agents and an expression of barely controlled urgency. Miss Rodriguez, we've just received intelligence that Sterling Financial is planning to move a large quantity of valuable assets out of their building tonight. Our sources suggest this may be related to the artifacts you've documented. We need to act immediately. Elena's blood ran cold. Someone knows about my investigation? We're not sure how, but Victoria Sterling apparently received information that their private storage areas may have been compromised. She's ordered an emergency relocation of what our surveillance indicates are the exact artifacts you photographed. Agent Chen leaned across the table. Miss Rodriguez, we need your help. You know the building's layout and you have access credentials. We can get a warrant to search the premises, but if the artifacts are moved before we can secure them, this entire investigation becomes infinitely more complicated.
Elena understood the implication. This was her chance to ensure the stolen treasures were recovered and returned to their rightful place in human heritage. But it also meant putting herself at enormous personal risk by actively cooperating with the federal investigation against one of Chicago's most powerful families. "What do you need me to do?" Elena asked. Agent Chen outlined the plan quickly. Federal agents would position themselves around Sterling Financial Tower, while Elena provided real-time intelligence about any movement of artifacts from the basement storage areas. If the Sterling family attempted to remove the collections, Elena would signal the agents who would then execute the warrant and secure the evidence. "Miss Rodriguez, I want to be clear about the risks," Agent Chen said. "If Victoria Sterling realizes you're the source of this investigation, you could face serious retaliation. The Sterling family has enormous resources and political connections." Elena thought about Miguel, about the stable life she had built from the ruins of her academic career, about the medical bills she was still paying and the job she couldn't afford to lose. Then she thought about Dr. Klaus Weber, who had died, never knowing the treasures he mourned were perfectly preserved in a Chicago basement. She thought about all the European families and communities who had lost pieces of their cultural identity to wartime theft. "I understand the risks," Elena said. "These artifacts belong in museums, not private collections. I won't let them disappear again." That evening, Elena arrived at Sterling Financial Tower for what might be her final shift as a night janitor. Federal agents were positioned discreetly around the building, and Elena carried a communication device that would allow her to coordinate with Agent Chen's team. Elena began her shift normally, but within an hour she noticed unusual activity in the building. Security guards were moving through areas they typically avoided, and several elevators were running on restricted access modes. At 11:30 p.m., Elena saw the first clear sign that her worst fears were justified. A convoy of unmarked trucks had arrived at the building's loading dock, and teams of movers were preparing equipment that looked designed for transporting valuable artifacts. Elena immediately contacted Agent Chen. "They're here," Elena whispered into her communication device. "Professional art movers with climate-controlled transport containers. This is definitely an emergency relocation."
Stay in position and keep us informed, Agent Chen replied. We're ready to move as soon as we have confirmation they're removing the artifacts you documented. Elena positioned herself where she could observe the basement levels without being detected. At midnight, she watched as Victoria Sterling herself arrived at the building, accompanied by several men who looked like private security rather than typical Sterling financial employees. Elena had never seen Victoria Sterling in person before, and she was struck by how different the CEO looked under stress. The composed executive who appeared in business magazines was replaced by a woman who moved with the urgency of someone whose life's work was collapsing around her. Elena followed the group at a distance as they descended to level B4. She watched from a concealed position as Victoria Sterling opened Vault 7 with her own key and began directing the removal of the artifacts Elena had documented just days earlier. Agent Chen, they're in the vault. Victoria Sterling is personally overseeing the removal of the collections. They're loading everything into specialized transport containers. Confirmed. We're moving in now. Ms. Rodriguez, please remain in a safe location until we've secured the scene. Elena watched from her hiding place as FBI agents flooded into the basement levels of Sterling Financial Tower. The confrontation was swift and professional, with agents presenting their warrant and immediately securing the area around Vault 7. Victoria Sterling's reaction was a mixture of rage and resignation. Elena could hear her voice echoing through the basement corridors as she demanded to speak with her attorneys and insisted that the artifacts were legitimate family property. These items have been in my family's possession for generations. We have complete documentation of their acquisition and ownership. Miss Sterling, we have evidence suggesting these artifacts were stolen from European collections during World War II. You will have opportunity to present your documentation, but right now we're securing potential evidence of international art theft. Elena remained hidden until the initial confrontation was resolved and the FBI had taken control of Vault 7. Only then did she emerge from concealment and approach Agent Chen. Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for your cooperation. Your evidence and assistance have been crucial to this operation. Victoria Sterling's eyes fixed on Elena with immediate recognition and fury. You, she said, her voice filled with venom. You're the cleaning woman. You stole from my office. Elena met Victoria Sterling's gaze without flinching. I found evidence of cultural theft that has been hidden for 80 years. These artifacts belong in museums, not private vaults. You have no idea what you've done, Victoria Sterling said. My family built this company, employed thousands of people, supported museums and cultural institutions across the country. You've destroyed all of that for some medieval trinkets that no one has missed for decades.